Hi, my name is Jason Leon, and I'd like to give you a brief presentation on Scrum. We'll be covering the significance, history of Scrum, and a brief understanding of the framework. I'm a producer programmer, been so for over 10 years. You can find out more about me at jasonleon.com. Let's get it rolling. So first of all, Scrum is not an acronym. It's borrowed from the game of rugby, and it's meant to give a theme of teamwork, folks working together down in a huddle sort of thing. Here's a specific definition. A project management framework for self-organizing teams, self-organizing is important, utilizing iterative development that is driven by providing value faster. It allows for a steady customer feedback, stable tested code, and reliable release planning. These are the guys that invented Scrum, but they did so with help by adapting other ideas. That's Dr. Jeff Sutherland on the left and Ken Schwaber on the right. It began with a document called the New Product Development Game back in 1986, which was basically a document that looked at the automotive, photo machine, computer, and printing industries and took the companies that were doing better than their competition and evaluated why and how that was working, and thus the sort of iterative approach, as opposed to what we'll talk about in a minute, the sequential approach was born. Here's a brief history, timeline at least. 1986, New Product Development Game surfaces. 1995, Sutherland and Schwaber give their presentation on Scrum based off of what they've learned from studying new product development and other such works. Then in 2001, the Agile Manifesto, which is a summit of a lot of brilliant programmers and project managers get together. Big names like Kent Beck, Lester Clockburn, or Ward Cunningham were all there. That's where the sort of tenets or the tent poles of what Agile or what it means to have an Agile project were set to stone. Scrum is not sequential development, or otherwise known as waterfall development or the waterfall model. The waterfall model, if you're not sure if you're using it or not, it basically has a conception and initiation analysis phase up front. Design then comes construction, and then at the close of construction you test, and then from that point forward you maintain it. It came from building buildings, I believe, was where the initial concept actually came from construction. And what it doesn't allow you to do is be agile, right? So the waterfall model, you can imagine, is like a giant luxury liner, huge boat that takes a long time to turn. Whereas iterative development, or what Scrum is more like a motorboat. Very quick on turns, agile. The luxury boat, to continue the analogy, is able to carry a lot of information with it, whereas the motorboat is you have to be selective as to what you're working on at any point in time. These are folks that are using it: Yahoo and Google. They're large companies. High Moon Studios was the first big video game company to popularize Scrum. Here are some of the benefits that you would gain by implementing it for your own projects. One thing I've heard that it's interesting is Scrum allows you to fail faster. That's something you might hear if you ever go to any of the local meetings on Scrum, and it's really true. What it allows you to do is figure out whether something's working or not quickly. So I guess we should probably get into the details of what the framework are now. Let's start with the roles. So here is a picture of the roles. You got your product owner, your Scrum Master, your team, your stakeholders, and your customers. It's that simple. Those are the categories. First is the product owner. So the product owner is a guy that's going to manage your product backlog, and we'll talk about that tool in a little bit. He's also, or she is also, responsible for keeping the product profitable and having the customer's best interest in mind at any point in time. That's the core responsibility of the product owner. Scrum Master is the opposite of the product owner, and there should always be a small tension between the two. Whereas the product owner wants the product done faster and with the most features, the Scrum Master is responsible for keeping the integrity of the underlying code in place. So they should be the no man if the product owner is pushing too hard for too many features and the Scrum Master knows that it's just not possible. That's the sort of tension that I'm talking about. It's better that the Scrum Master is in a book called Succeeding with Agile. Mike Cohn describes him as the servant leader, and that's a really good definition, I think, because the Scrum Master should be a humble leader, not an overbearing, bullish leader. But they're the guy that removes impediments for the rest of the team. The Scrum Master in your group needs to be someone that everyone looks up to. The Scrum team is typically made up of testers, programmers, and designers. If we're talking about game development or software development, and those are definitions of obviously QA, the folks that find defects and such, engineers, the guys that are doing the architecture and implementation of code, and designers. What is it going to look like? Stakeholders. These are your benefactors. These are your VPs. These are anyone that's not hands-on development. Those would be your stakeholders. Something you might look up is pigs and chickens. Look at that up on Wikipedia, and it'll give you a kind of fun way to think about the difference between stakeholders and the actual Scrum team. The customers, in the end of the line, that's what we're all working towards, is to make something that they're going to be satisfied with. All right. Now, in the Schwaber and Summerland analogies for Scrum, they call this next portion ceremonies, and they say that's let's just go into them. The ceremonies, we have the sprint, we have the sprint planning meeting, the daily Scrum meeting, and the retrospectives. I'll start with describing the sprint. And the sprint is each iteration of development. It's going to span a certain amount of time, and it's going to, most importantly, end with done software. That's software that's been unit tested, acceptance tested, and that does what it says that it was going to do. And we'll talk about how we find out what it says it's going to do in the next slide. But this is the core of what our Scrum is all about, these sprints. The duration, now I've seen durations all over the place. Ken Schwaber recommends 30 days. Personally, I think that's too much time. 2 weeks would be, I think, the longest that I would want my sprints to be. I like actually 1 week. I think 1 week sprints are a solid choice, and I've tried everything from starting them on Mondays and ending them on Fridays to starting them on Wednesdays and ending them on the following Wednesday, and to each his own. Really, it's up to your group to decide when works best for you, and you'll do that by testing it. Sprint planning meetings. So the sprint planning meetings are the initialization of the sprint. That's where you're going to figure out off of the product backlog, which is a giant list of all of the requirements that you have, what you can pull off and do for your sprint and put it onto your sprint backlog. Those are basically two lists, right? The product backlog has everything that you need to do over the course of the software development cycle, and the sprint backlog is what you're working on in each iteration. Typically, your product owner is the one that's going to be what's called grooming the product backlog, or shuffling the priorities based off of what he's getting from the other stakeholders as the direction that they should head, or off of his own research or her own research as to what the market requires for your product. Next up, the daily Scrum. So daily Scrum is basically a meeting that you hold every day, and it's also referred to as the standing Scrum because you actually stand. as you have this. You stand in a circle. Some folks recommend that you stand in front of a product backlog or sprint backlog board so you can all see what everyone's working on in a horseshoe shape, or you can stand in a circle. These need to be less than 15 minutes, and honestly, 15 minutes is too long. When your team is humming, when you really got the whole thing down, and you have a good what's called rhythm, then you're going to be nailing these things in less than 10 minutes, sometimes 5 minutes. You basically just need to answer 3 questions. What have I done since the last meeting? Or what did I do yesterday? What will I do until the next meeting? Or what will I do today? And what are my impediments? Right? If you answer those 3 questions, everyone in the group, you have a great sense as to how the project's doing. And the important thing with the impediments is that's when your Scrum Master or your product owner will pick those up and try and remove the barrier for you, so that you as a Scrum team member, be a designer, programmer, or tester, are freed up to just focus on what you need to accomplish that day. Retrospectives, that's the full circle of the feedback loop. Retrospective is basically at the close, once you have your done shippable software. And when we say shippable software, we don't mean software that you would put in the box. We mean that it's a finished piece that actually functions as was intended. That's where you do your learning, your evaluating. This is the scientific method. We want to evaluate what we just did and see what worked and what didn't work so that we can try and address it in the next sprint. This is a graph that basically shows what I just described. The sprint planning meeting up front, you can do those in 3 hours or less. When you're really moving, like halfway through your product development cycle, I'd say you're getting those things done in an hour, 2 hours if it's a really in-depth component that needs a lot of thinking. But that's it, and then you're off. You're off for your next to finish the project, to get to your next retrospective or the product demo. Artifacts. So artifacts are another term that the Scrum that Sutherland and Schwaber use for your product backlog, your sprint backlog, and the burn down chart. So product backlog is just a list of user stories. Is one solution for describing how each of these components are described. And you can learn more about user stories by looking up what is the name of that book? Succeeding with Agile, or User Stories Applied by Mike Cohn. He writes a lot on the subject. But even if you don't, it's basically just a deliverable. The description of a deliverable is what each product backlog item is. They're prioritized. I said grooming. Grooming is another term for just shuffling the what we work on next, and make sure that your product owner is doing that. Sprint backlog, simple. It's what we're working on during this iteration, and it's like a pull fashion. I like to have the Scrum team members actually pull their own projects if possible, because that gives them they're the most empowered because they've selected what they want to work on, and I think it just makes for a better experience in general. And finally, the burn down chart, and the burn down chart is just the history of the product backlog. To be honest, it's a graphical representation of what's happened. You imagine the x-axis on a graph being the products and the y-axis being time. So this is what an example of a burn down chart might look like. Simple as that. So that's Scrum in a nutshell, and I definitely suggest giving it a shot if you're not currently implementing Scrum or an Agile methodology, because it's for me it was night and day. I was a big supporter of the waterfall method. A lot of documentation. And just over the years, I've gotten more and more into Agile, and I find that Agile is so much more effective and just a better work cycle and work life for everyone on the team. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, hit me up on my blog, jasonleon.com. Thanks a lot. Bye.